Hello, this lecture series is on how to write a good quality research paper. So what I'm going to try and do is just to identify some of the main factors associated with starting the publication process off, considering writing for publication and working hard to be able to get that paper accepted if possible. My name's Dr. Amanda Lee. I'm a Dean at Global Banking Solutions and I'm also an editor for Nursing Open, which is an open access journal. Many of these slides have been based on originals which were initially organised by Professor Mark Hayter, and he's the Editor-in-Chief for the Journal of Clinical Nursing. So before you even start to consider publishing, here's where you need to start thinking about who are the authors for the paper, for the manuscript. Agree between you what team you're going to have, who's going to do what, and who's going to claim first, second, third, last authorship. There's very, very good guidance on authorship using the ICMJE criteria. Declare any conflicts of interest, get your team to identify whether they have any financial, commercial, legal or professional relationships which might well have had any influence on that paper. Once you've done that, once you've all agreed to start moving forwards with the project and to start to format the manuscript, the next thing to do is to start looking at the journals. And there's an array of different journals which are subject specific or methodology specific, so make sure that you choose the right fit for your particular research. The first thing is to target your journal. Choose one which is absolutely appropriate to your research. The second step is to get on that website and have a look at the author guidelines. Download any available templates that there may well be and have a look and play with the Scholar One system or whatever system it is to see how your journal submission is going to look. You're likely to need tables in a different format and figures in a different format. They'll have their own referencing guidelines and they'll have their own sort of ways to format your abstract and everything else. So just get onto those author guidelines, determine which paper you're going to write, what type of methodology, what type of research you're presenting, whether it's a systematic literature review. Make sure all these sorts of things are affiliated with the targeted journal that you're looking at. Step 3, and I would suggest this really strongly, start looking at some of the previously published papers that have come through that journal. You know full well they've been through the editorial process and they've been through the publication process. So start to look to see what standards and quality and levels of writing you would be expected to be able to denote before you can be accepted within that journal. Have a look to see how previous authors have presented their work, how their data is managed, how they've managed to sort of display their content and how they've explained their subject matter. I'm not suggesting plagiarising. What I am suggesting is just get a feel for that particular journal so that you can make sure that your publication affiliates with that journal. Many author guidelines are quite similar across journals. And this is really important if you don't get through the peer review process for your first chosen journal. And that's a lot easier when you can resubmit to a different journal if your journal is formatted in accordance with some of the more lenient guidelines. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to start with title, move to abstract, and then continue all the way through the different components of a research paper. However, we don't always write in that way. We don't always write in that order. Many times the title comes last, and certainly I've found that's the case. But this slide's about developing sort of the great title. What sort of things do we need to put in our title? Well, first of all, you need some really good words. So you need the words that are going to describe exactly what your subject matter is. It's helpful if you put the research method in as well. Now there's 3 ways, or there's a number of different ways that you can actually do, but they can all fall into 3 different categories. A research paper title in an academic journal can declare what's going on. So for example, stress levels linked to absenteeism in academia, a quantitative study. That's a nice, short, sharp title. The other thing that it can do is describe. So for example, the mediating effects of stress on absenteeism in academia. That's all right. It doesn't tell us what type of study it is. You'd potentially consider, if something's presenting some data on mediating effects, there'd be some type of quantitative analysis in there, but that's assumed. But what we've done there is we've tried to describe what's within the article. Or the title could sort of interrogate the reader, for example. Does stress cause absenteeism in the UK academic settings? And you could even add to that a quantitative analysis. It's up to you. The most important thing is keep your title short, sharp, snappy. Make sure that you've told the reader what it is within the paper. Just a couple of hints and tips here about keeping a research title clear and simple. One of the most important factors is make sure that you keep it very, very concise. And the APA 2009 actually suggested that no more than 12 words. There are many research journals and articles out there that have got hundreds of words, and they try and put too much information, too much detail within the title. And that's actually contrary to making your work citable, to making your work applicable within the databases, the search engines. So for the most optimal database search engine searchability, you need to make sure that you've got a nice, snappy, short title. You must also make sure as well that the words that you use in your title are absolutely reflective of the subject matter that you're trying to present. Equally, try and think from international terms. Have a think about what that means as well, and try not to pop country names or area names within your research paper. Because if you've got other people that are looking from an international perspective, they're looking at the whole subject matter. They don't want to try and reduce down to different country level or country specific sort of priorities, unless you are dealing with something, you know, for example in geography, where you might well be searching a certain, or you might well be presenting something in a particular delta or whatever else, whether it's absolutely relevant to the research at hand. But do try, think international, think how am I going to make this more applicable to an international audience. The other thing that we need to think about is trying to avoid acronyms. So we don't want abbreviations, we don't want acronyms within your title, and the reason for that is because they might not be transferable to an international audience. The other thing, same with the humour and irony as well. Think about how that's going to translate. If you've got an international reader who's looking at English and that may not well be their second language, how's that going to work, and could it well be misjudged or misinterpreted? So be really clear. Make sure your title is clear and simple. And this enhancing discoverability slide actually does give you some more options why we're thinking about our title, because alongside the title we're also going to be asked, or most journals ask, for up to 6 keywords that they're asking for. So then that way places like the search engines, the mesh search term headings, and all of the online databases can pick up and detect your particular paper as relevant to research. Now this is absolutely essential to inform systematic literature reviews, metasynthesis and meta-analysis of data. And what you're hoping for any research publication is that you can start to, your work's going to start to be picked up by other academics, and they're going to use your findings to build that body of knowledge. So think about those search terms really carefully. Think about the Boolean operands that you'd be thinking, so and, or, how they're going to be shortened. So use methods that you could use to find and cite a paper and see whether that could be different. Think about the different spellings as well. So for example, esophageal cancer. The American and the English version of those spellings are very, very different. So think about what other people will be using in these databases to see how your keywords work. Keywords are exactly as they say, they're key to optimized search engine discoverability. So you must choose your words really carefully. They're also used as adjunct to the title. So, you can use your title and the abstract, where you should be sort of making sure that the words are the same in each, but keywords are adjunct to the title and the abstract. So that's going to help searchers mop up any other information or resources within those databases that are relevant to the particular subject matter or the relevant methodology. Your keywords must always include that main subject or focus, but have a think about it, because if you think something like diabetes, that's going to get your title immersed with hundreds of thousands of other papers that are on diabetes. So think about trying to make them relatively specific to your particular subject. What is it that makes your paper relatively unique, and how can your keywords reflect that? Your keywords must also reflect what's in the abstract and what's in the title as well. Some authors do advise repeating keywords in the abstract, and that does optimise that search engine discoverability. Try using, like we used the diabetes example, try not to use specific words because they're too generalisable. You're going to end up being buried under a big mound of everybody else's research, and you don't want that. You want your paper to stand out, to be different. We editors, when we're looking at nursing journals, we use the keywords to be able to find potential peer reviewers as well. So have a think about that. Have a think about how the publication process works, because you know those keywords that you put in will yield potential peer reviewers who are going to look at your submission and say whether or not you're going to get published. Depending on the journal that you look for and that you're going to be presenting your paper to, different journals will ask you to present around about 6 to 8 keywords. Some allow a keyword to be made up of 1 or 2 words or 3 words, and others ask for specific 1-word keywords. So just make sure that you follow the author guidelines, and that tends to be in your, in the process by which you're starting to submit your papers. It's always worthwhile having a go at performing the search of yourself. The keywords that you're presenting, run a quick search yourself in the database that you're usually using as well. Have a look to see what that yields and see whether or not your paper would be relevant to that yield. There's a couple of online sort of forums as well, and online sort of tools that you can use. So Google Trends, for example, gives an idea about what terms everybody else is using in relation to a subject. So have a play with Google Trends, and you can use the hyperlink that's on this slide. Your abstract is second to the title when it comes to importance, because this is the thing that lures your readers in. It gets people to start looking at your paper in a bit more detail. It connects that reader to all of your papers and all the content. So it's really important that you get this right. Many publications will ask for a structured abstract, so they'll give you different subheadings to be able to present underneath. If you're looking at the background, what you should be offering your reader is what is known, what's already known, and what do you seek to present. And remember, you're presenting to an international audience. All publications, all journals are aiming towards an international readership. So make sure that your background is subject specific and relevant to international, not just little local areas. The background should also just identify to the reader, what was your hypothesis? Why are you doing the study? What's the major focus of this paper? The methods section, for example, just gives us an idea about what was done and how was it done. So this should offer a little bit of information on your method, your design, your settings, your sampling technique and participants, how many were there, how long did the study take, what interventions were you checking out or evaluating, what research instruments you used, and what were your primary outcome measures. The results section is just going to identify what the results found. So really very, very brief snapshot on your research findings. It's going to describe the population. It's going to give us the p-values, for example, or the themes for qualitative research. And it's just going to give the reader an idea of what the study was about and what the study found. Conclusion should just be short, snappy, quick little bit. What's your overall message? What does this mean to your readers? What will change after you've read this particular paper or done this particular piece of research? Are there any new perspectives that can be identified within your professional agenda? First part of any academic paper is the introduction and the background, and some people choose to have an introduction separately to the background. Basically, the introduction is just going to introduce the paper and tell the reader what you're going to tell them. The background is a little bit more detailed, so here is where you're forming that whole argument, the basis of your paper, the academic rationale for why you're doing the study in the first place. So you may well present a full literature review which identifies the gaps in knowledge and those sorts of areas where you've raised awareness that something needs studying, something needs finding out, and that's what your paper intends to do. Any introduction and background section will end with a clear statement. These are the gaps in knowledge we've identified. This is what this study is going to do. These are the aims and objectives of my study, and perhaps provide a clear statement. What is your proposed hypothesis? Or what are your research questions, your aims, your objectives of the study? So the next section of your paper is the methods section. And here's where we start to look at, how did you conduct your research? What are you going to do? How are you answering that research question that you presented in the introduction, background element? And here's where you can really start to show the reader how you managed your subject, what sort of populations you analysed, how you sampled those populations, what inclusion and exclusion criteria you used, whether they be clinical or academic or professional. What was the nature of your ethics application? Were there any ethical implications to researching these particular subjects? And what happened there? And have you had any formal ethics review process? We must always use the methods section to actually identify how we made sure that that data collection was rigorous or reliable, depending on which type of methodology you use. So here's where you present your reader with information on the instruments that you used and whether or not you used any validation mechanisms or whether such tools have been pre-validated in previous studies. What you're trying to show is what criteria did you use for rigour, transparency, validity, reliability. Depending on how you are going to be answering the question, you need to make sure that you're using the right research nomenclature. You need to present your reader with any other factors, any sort of extraneous or confounding factors that may well impact your findings. So for example, if you were using a survey in a different language, that data would have been, or those data would have been translated into a different language. Were there any potential conflicts there? How did you manage your data? Were there any sampling problems? Did you have any problems that happened? Were there any sort of missing completions of surveys or different tools? Did things work? The most important thing here is be open and transparent. Be really, really clear. Make sure that those data as well were for the sole purpose of your study. And if they weren't, so that you avoid any pitfalls, for example, accusations of falsification, you must identify how were the data collected. Were those data collected for your study, or have you sort of managed to extract the data to address a different research hypothesis than originally intended? If that's the case, it's fine, but what you must do is acknowledge that within your paper. Now the other part of a methods section as well is just to identify what your methods of analysis are as well, or to be and were. So how did you calculate the amount of people that you had to sample to make something clinically significant? What were your confidence intervals based on, and how did you determine confidence intervals? And what p-value did you determine as confidence intervals? Did you perform any quantitative analysis processes? If you used, for example, logistic linear regression or other types of different types of examples, how did you use them? Why did you use them? And how were they appropriate? Also state which computer packages you used. So for statisticians, for example, you might have used R, SPSS, Excel to be able to manage data. Qualitative, you might be using NVivo or all the other packages which are there to be able to help you with thematic analysis and coding. Must always reference any of the seminal authors if you are applying somebody else's methods and research methods or techniques, always just make sure, so that we avoid any problems, for example, of plagiarism, that we always make sure that we reference sources of information that we have used in our papers. And then you get to the coolest bit, the results. And here's where you're going to just make sure that all you're going to do is just present the results of your work. Nobody else's, nothing else is going to go into that section. What did you find? Now this is the real cool bit, because you can start to use graphs or tables or figures, whatever you want to do to make sure that you can present those data and findings in the most user-friendly word. When I'm presenting lectures on academic writing or how to conduct research or anything else, one of the first things that I always do when I'm asking my students to critique papers is have a look at the numbers, make sure that they add up, have a look at how authors have presented the data. Because if as a reader you can't understand what authors are presenting, it's not the reader's fault, it's actually the author's fault. We need to make sure that our abstracts, our results, our methodology, everything else is utterly readable, utterly understandable. So always present your results in the most appropriate and decent manner. Just as a side note, most journals require your tables and figures to be held as separate documents or submitted as separate documents as well. So I tend to just pop a folder in my on my desktop when I'm working on the computer, and that folder will contain just the one paper with all the affiliated tables, figures, the title page, which will have, of course, all the names and your ORC IDs and everything else of your researcher teams. But make sure that you just keep it all together, but always save your tables and figures as a separate entity, and then that way you know exactly what they are. Make sure that they're also saved under that name of Fig 1, Fig 2, Fig 3, Table 1, Table 2, Table 3. When you finish writing your manuscript, always just have last read through and make sure that what you can do is look and you have referenced every single table and every single figure that you've presented in your data. There's a bit of an issue with qualitative research as well, and it's a really difficult one for novice researchers starting with qualitative data presentation. It's getting that beautiful balance between participant narrative and your own points that you're trying to make or your own themes that you're trying to do. How many participant narratives do you need to illustrate what you're trying to suggest or what you're pooling together? And here's where it becomes complicated, and here's where you just use your research team. You make sure that you've all formed consensus opinion in what you would like to pick up, what you would like to present to your reader. So your discussion's the cool bit. This is where you start to identify what you've found, and you're going to link it back to that initial background and introduction. What did you find? How does that compare with the wider literature? Are there any other sort of forms of literature out there that might actually corroborate or disagree with what you're trying to say? What's out there, and how can we move the body of knowledge forwards given what you've just presented within this paper? You must form a decent discussion about anything that you have raised throughout the process of your research. Whether there are any implications to real world practice or phenomenon. You must also try and raise any implications to your study. It doesn't have to be negative. You can actually present the limitations to your study in a very different way. You know, this study found this happened in this population. It might not relate to somebody in this population. However, there's need for further study. So have a think about how you can present those limitations, but also, you know, we can't be all things to all people. We have to make sure that we can, you know, we recognise that one research paper will not answer every single question on a given subject. There's always going to be need for further research, further evaluation. The discussion should also identify any sort of recommendations that might well be for policy, practice, or to inform something that's going on within that body of evidence and body of knowledge. And finally, your conclusion. This is where you've got a few short, snappy sentences which provide a summary of what you've done. identify those main implications, present a statement on where we're going next, and make sure the conclusion does not introduce anything new whatsoever, because the conclusion is exactly what it says on the tin. It's the end, it's the conclusion. So don't introduce anything new, don't introduce any new references or new ideas. That's your discussion to do that. Your discussion will organise what sort of things they are, and that discussion should have completed that process. Nursing Open is a peer-reviewed open access journal. We welcome articles for submission on all types of nursing and midwifery practice. We also welcome research papers, pedagogical research papers that support education, and any papers which may well be useful to support policy development. Our main goal is to publish articles that contribute to the art and science of nursing, and those which have a positive impact on health, either locally, nationally, regionally, or globally. We're promoting our profession as nurses to ensure rigorous, peer-reviewed excellent standards of academic practice.